We have low prices for farm products because other countries won't buy our stuff. They won't buy our stuff because we won't buy their stuff because we erected the highest tariff in U.S. history. See, so in other words, we won't buy watches from Switzerland, so they won't buy corn and wheat from the American Midwest. So all of a sudden we've got this huge surplus, and the prices are way low. Now, I know to people in this room, if I were to suggest this is a problem, and say, you know, if you were my students, and say, well now, how might we solve this problem? And I throw this open, by the way, when I teach in my classroom at Hillsdale, I get a student who comes, you know, sometimes it'll be someone sheepish, well, I'm no economist, but I would think that maybe getting rid of the tariff might help. I say, I wish you, instead of Professor Black, would have been in decision-making capacity over there, because that's exactly a good solution. If you get rid of the tariff, then they'll buy our farm products and we can buy their stuff. But no, Roosevelt didn't want to do that because a lot of the people where we had the high tariffs were where votes were. See, in other words, we were tariffing certain products. One of them, well, like the watches with Switzerland. The watchmakers were concentrated in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And they didn't make as good a watch as they made in Switzerland. And so we had to keep the tariff high so that they could sell more watches, even though they were not. These watches ran the hour in 58 minutes. I see some are as old as I am and remember the winding the watch, and when you wind it, it would go faster. Yeah, those were the watches that we had. And Switzerland had these watches that ran the minute in 1 minute. And they were better, and most people bought them, except that we had them tariffed so high that you couldn't afford them. And so Switzerland actually refused to buy our products as well. And so we had this horrible situation, and Roosevelt said, well, I want to get the votes from the watchmakers in Rhode Island and Switzerland, so I will keep the tariff. And now, Roosevelt did have some reduction of the tariff in his administration, but I wish he had a whole lot more than he did. In any case, Roosevelt's major plan was the AAA, and he said, what we'll do is the farmers are not making much money, so we'll give them, we'll pay them not to produce.
Yeah.
We'll pay them not to produce. Then they'll get more money, and because they're not producing on part of their land, they'll get more, higher for their crops, higher price, because there won't be as much crop. It's a wonderful system. Professor Black, of course, you know, he was a professor. So far at Hillsdale, they haven't come up to me and offered to pay me not to teach. Now, how many would like to be paid not to do the work that you're doing? It was funny because I have this in the book because I thought it was so funny because Harold Ickes, who was Secretary of the Interior, had this thing. Says, well, now wait a minute, where do we draw the line on this? You know, if we're paying people not to do something, where do we draw the line? And you could see even internally that was confusing some people. Nonetheless, in the Roosevelt administration, we're going to pay farmers not to produce. Now Roosevelt thought, well, this is beautiful. Now farmers will get more money and they'll vote for me. And that was sort of beginning to happen, except that there was a problem. Roosevelt was leaning back, and he heard from Washington in the Ag Department horrible news. And the news was that some of the farmers, now it's going to be hard to believe, and I hope if we have some farmers here, I saw some beautiful artichokes and all of that being grown around here, and I hope if we have people here, I know you wouldn't have done this, but what we had were some farmers who were taking the money not to produce, and then they sneaked out and produced on that stretch of land that they were not supposed to produce on, so that they could make double money. They were told they could take 1/4 of their land out of circulation and be paid, it was usually $10 an acre, which would be more like $100 an acre today, not to produce on that acreage. And when you consider that $1,000 a year was a good income back in the 1930s, you can do pretty well not producing. And Roosevelt said, well, we sent inspectors around to inspect everybody's land so that they couldn't grow anything and get not to grow. And Roosevelt was relieved and sat back, and then he heard some most unpleasant news. Some of the farmers were taking the money that they were being paid not to produce and were paying a portion of that money to the inspector to look the other way. And so Roosevelt had a solution for that. We're going to send an army of inspectors out to inspect the inspectors to keep people from growing crops on land that they've taken out of circulation and that we're paying them not to produce. There are certain things in life that are sometimes wild, and I had one of those. And my first job was in Kentucky, and I had this old Southern gentleman. Who was the senior member of the department. And I didn't even, I was trying to be good with him. I was hoping to get tenure. And he was going on this trip, and I had an offer. I could join him and be the other person on the trip with him. I had another person. I thought, well, I'm not even sure if the senior man knows who I am. And I thought, here's my chance to get in good with him, and then they'll want to give me tenure. And so I went on the trip, and we were talking with each other and getting to know each other. And he asked me what I did before I got to school there at Kentucky, and I asked what he did. He's a Southerner and grew up in Arkansas and in Tennessee and part of his time in Kentucky. And then he said, one summer, I worked as an inspector for the AAA. I just went on, did you take any bribes? And he didn't miss a beat. He just said, no, the best offer I had was a set of tires. And then he launched into a tirade saying, those inspectors in the southern part of the county was where all the good bribes came from. And I was stuck over here and didn't get any offer better than a set of tires. I felt kind of bad for him. I was sitting there on one hand trying to dissect, being a good conservative, this was bad policy, and on the other hand feeling sorry for my superior here who had not gotten any money with his bribe. He did vote for me to get tenure, and I appreciate that he did do that. But I merely say that some of these programs, you couldn't sit somebody down and say, well, what are we going to do about the farm problem? And somebody said, well, we'll just pay them not to produce. We ended up with a huge budget deficit in the Department of Agriculture, and it was capped because there were people bribing the inspectors. And the result was that we bought a fleet of airplanes to go over and take pictures of everybody's land to find out if the inspectors were being honest and the farmers were being honest. And the Ag Department had this huge budget. And this is how the United States, in 8 years, in Roosevelt's first two administrations, his first 8 years as president, we more than doubled the national debt. And we sharply increased taxes, but we more than doubled the national debt. These are the kinds of programs, and I'll tell you, I divide the New Deal into these programs into the the bad programs and the horrendous programs. I've just given you the bad ones. The horrendous ones either have death rates or jail rates. And I just want to go through one that the NRA, this is not the gun, which we sometimes felt we needed in these circumstances, but this is National Recovery Act, NRA, National Recovery Act. And the National Recovery Act, here again, it's one of these things. What are you going to do? Businessmen are complaining that their prices are low. And Roosevelt says, let's have businessmen get in a group and set the price they would like people to have to pay for their product and make it legally binding. And if any businessman gives anybody a discount, he goes to jail. That is a remarkable testimony. That was what became law. And I have some reports in the book, The New Deal or Raw Deal, of people who went to jail. And I just want to read one, was Jacob Maged. He was a Hungarian immigrant. The NRA code for pressing a pair of pants was 40 cents to press a pair of pants, and he was charging 35. He was giving customers a nickel, and when they asked him why he did that, he said, "My tailor shop is several blocks off of Main Street. If every tailor has to charge 40 cents to press a pair of pants, they don't come 6 blocks out of the way to go to my shop, they go to the ones on Main Street. I have to give a discount to get people in my shop." He gave them a discount and he went to jail. And I think it's interesting. Some newspapers were sympathetic with it. The Washington Post said, "If Maged had to charge less than the bright, shiny tailor shop up the street if he wanted to continue to exist, the law said he could not." The New York Herald Tribune said this, "For a parallel to the Maged case, it is necessary to go to the fascist or communist states of Europe." I'm happy to report that the Supreme Court struck down the National Recovery Act 9-0. Some of you may be seeing a parallel already. The Supreme Court can sometimes emerge, or at least courts, to declare certain clearly unconstitutional acts, forcing people to charge a certain amount for the product that they are making, clearly unconstitutional, and came to the rescue, and that was declared unconstitutional. Roosevelt, however, we had a president who could not get us out of the Great Depression, and we had double-digit unemployment. We had 20% unemployment at the end of his second term in office. And I begin the book, in fact, with just a quotation from his Secretary of Treasury, who says this, Henry Morgenthau. It's Roosevelt's own Secretary of Treasury. He says, "We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just one interest, and if I am wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this country prosper. So I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot." I wish that those lessons were taught in the classroom during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, because if they had, historians, as some of you know, have in the Arthur Schlesinger Historians Poll ranked Franklin Roosevelt as the greatest or the second greatest president in U.S. history, higher than George Washington. A country whose historians ranks Franklin Roosevelt ahead of George Washington will get, 70 years later, Barack Obama. And I think Barack Obama was genuinely surprised to hear that there were people who thought the New Deal didn't work. It was funny because my book, I made an appearance on Glenn Beck's show, and there was some coverage of the New Deal. And Obama said, when a reporter brought this up, he said, "Well, what about the New Deal?" And there's criticism of it. And he said, "I thought everyone knew the New Deal got us out of the Great Depression." In other words, I thought everybody knew. But you can see, I want to give credit for consistency. If you really believe that that massive spending did get us out of the Great Depression, then it stands to reason that when you get into office, you will want to launch a stimulus package. And so we have a huge WPA, a parallel. President Obama, $862 billion, a stimulus package, and was shocked when the states receiving all of this money, virtually none of it, although some of it was used and created jobs in the short term, it had virtually no effect on unemployment. In fact, unemployment was going up, just as it did in the late 1930s. Unemployment had dropped to 15% in 1936. It was 20% in 1939. At a certain point, all of this heavy spending actually becomes counterproductive because people spend their own money better than central planners can spend. President Obama, we have the federal government buying $900 billion in long-term treasury bonds. We had a bailout